Welcome and thank you for joining part 4 of Seyfarth's micro webinar series, The Future Starts Now, Future of Work for New England Employers. This installment of the series will focus on monitoring remote and hybrid employees' performance and productivity. All participants are in listen-only mode. You are encouraged to submit questions throughout the program using the Q&A feature in WebEx. However, if your question is not answered, our presenters will follow up with you directly in the days ahead. For those interested in CLE credit, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation. Please write this code down as it will not be repeated and is required for CLE credit. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to attendees following the presentation. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Anthony Califano. Anthony, you may begin.
Thank you, David. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to part 4 of Seyfarth's Boston office Future of Work micro webinar series. As indicated, today we're going to take a quick dive into challenges associated with remote and hybrid workforces, and specifically we're going to cover wage and hour issues, productivity issues, and we'll touch upon accommodation issues toward the end. Also, as indicated, don't worry if you miss part of this presentation. There will be an email probably tomorrow that will send you the deck and a link so that you could listen to it. Also, you saw that this is part 4. Please don't worry if you missed parts 1 through 3 in this series. Each is independent. We're not building one off of the other, so you're not missing anything that you needed to listen in here. However, the link in the email that you'll get tomorrow will provide you with access to the prior presentations in this series. And again, we will provide the CLE code towards the end. Next slide, please. So before we dive too far here, here's our obligatory disclaimer, legal disclaimer for anybody not in a position to read it. The gist is that our presentation is general information. It's for general information purposes only. It's not intended to be legal advice, and please consult with your L&E lawyer regarding any specific situations you might have. Okay, next slide. A word on us. Your presentation today is brought to you by Seyfarth and 2 of its Boston attorneys, Emily Miller and me, Anthony Califano. We're both full-time management side labor and employment lawyers. We represent employers across the country and in the Northeast in particular for Emily and me. And we do so on the full range of L&E issues that companies face. We counsel companies to promote compliance and to avoid lawsuits, and then when litigation is necessary or unavoidable, we defend companies in them. Next slide. Okay, our agenda for today. During this short dive we're going to take during the next 25 to 30 minutes, we're going to cover first some background information regarding the present and future of remote and hybrid work arrangements. We'll talk about some facts and evidence that make this a timely topic for discussion and appropriate for your attention. Next, we'll go over some interesting and challenging topics that we know our clients and other employers face when it comes to remote and hybrid work arrangements and management. And we'll offer some best practice tips, hopefully, for you to consider for promoting wage and hour compliance and other legal compliance, and hopefully to limit legal claims. We will cover performance-related challenges in a remote hybrid environment and offer potential ways to address those challenges. And we will discuss the notion of accommodations in a remote and hybrid environment. And why? It's because we know that employers handling these issues consider them to be critical. This stuff is critical to employee morale and ultimately to business success. So with that, we'll go on to our next slide, and I'll kick it over to Emily.
Thanks, Anthony, and thanks everybody for being here today. So, I mean, just to lay the groundwork as to why do a presentation like this, The bottom line with remote work is that it remains widespread and very popular. Obviously, the pandemic really sort of accelerated the pace at which employers had to set up the technological infrastructure for their employees to work from somewhere outside of the office. You might remember from sort of early on in the pandemic, Twitter and Square came out right away and said, you know what, our employees can work from home forever. And while most pandemic-related workplace restrictions have been lifted at this point today, at least as of last June, 35% of the US workforce, which is about 55 million people, report that they are permitted to work from home on a full-time basis, 5 days a week, with another 23%, 36 million people, reporting that they're permitted to work from home at least part of the time. And so if my math is right, that's over 90 million people who are working from home at least some of the time. And when given the option to work, it's very popular. Almost 90% of workers will take advantage of that opportunity, with most choosing to work from home 3 days per week and to spend 2 days a week in the office. When it comes to top reasons why employees are looking for other jobs, among the top 3 reasons is the employee is not satisfied with their employer's flexible work arrangement policy. And so it seems like for the time being, at the very least, remote work is likely here to stay. Next slide. And there are some benefits. Research shows that telecommuting makes many workers more productive. They have more time to work, especially in major metropolitan areas. It's not unusual for an employee to spend an hour each way commuting to work. And what they found pretty early on is that, especially on the front end of the day, that morning commute, a lot of employees were still waking up at the same time that they would have otherwise, and they were just logging in. US workers actually increased their average workday by almost 40%. I do want to put one caveat here because that statistic sort of surprised me. That was from a study conducted pretty early on in the pandemic. And, I do wonder to what extent anxiety about job security and things like that were really pushing people to at the time. So I'd like to see that done again today. But there really is no doubt that it's particularly for employees who, need some uninterrupted time to just crank out the work that they're being asked to do. Anecdotally, from personal experience, there are certain assignments that, if I need to write a brief, if I need to do some research, if you're just home and can have that uninterrupted time, that employees can be more productive. And obviously balancing telework with on-site work for the employees who are working with a sort of a hybrid arrangement. Next slide. So there are some benefits. There are also some challenges. I personally have sort of felt for the people who have started in a new job during the pandemic, who didn't get to sort of go in and meet their colleagues in person before they got going. That sort of engagement, fostering community among employees, it's obviously a little bit more challenging if the employees aren't actually seeing one another, interacting in person, that type of thing. You also run into some workplace compliance issues, and especially for some of the employers who came out the gate early pandemic and said, you know what, work from anywhere, work from wherever you want. Some employers did that without considering whether they were subjecting themselves to other jurisdictions' laws about, taxes or workplace compliance issues, or trainings that might need to be provided, benefits that might need to be provided. So there are some sort of complicating factors if you have employees working wherever they want to be. But those are really sort of outside the scope of where we're going to go today, just given the tight time frame that we have. So we're going to focus here on this last bullet, which is really monitoring and managing performance and productivity for employees when they're not physically in the workspace. And so with that, I'm going to kick it over to Anthony to cover some of the wage and hour type implications.
Okay, we can go straight to the next slide, please. And so what we're going to do, let's start by going over a couple of the common or primary sources of risk and challenge that we see for employers in the remote and hybrid environment. First, really, I think the first challenge stems from a lack of clarity as to what is compensable work time. The law doesn't really offer a super clear definition of that, and so there's a fair amount of litigation and case law on the subject. You may have heard about the concepts of engaged to wait versus waiting to be engaged. And so an important question regarding what we might consider idle time is, who is the primary beneficiary of the time, the employer or the employee? And if there's a fair argument that the employer is benefiting from the employee's idle time, then the time should be considered compensable work time. And we offer, an example from the remote environment. So an employee at home logs on, and upon logging on, waits for an assignment. Maybe the employee is not doing much other than sitting in front of his or her computer until that first assignment comes in, but an employee who's required to log in at a particular time would be considered performing work, and thus that time should be considered compensable. Add to that example this question: what about an employee who says via email, all right, I'm logged in and I'm waiting for assignments? The question is the email the start of the employee's work shift or day, or does it occur sometime before that when the employee starts to log on? And have you factored those things into the notion of compensable work time? Here's another challenge. I think the other real important challenge that we often see employees face is tied to meal breaks, right? Meal breaks, if they're duty-free, can be unpaid. To make a meal break unpaid, and properly so, the employee has to be completely relieved of duty. That means that interruptions or requirements imposed on the employee during that meal break can turn that meal break, the entire meal break, into compensable work time. And so here's the example, right, or an example. The employee's scheduled lunch break is from 12 to 12:30. Our goal is for that to be a non-compensable meal break. But at 12:18, the employee responds to an email from a supervisor with one word. That word is yes, in response to a question. And then the question becomes, does the employee now need to be paid for that entire 30-minute period because the employee responded to one email during that time? And there's a fair argument that that time becomes compensable because it was interrupted and the employee could not use that entire 30-minute break for their own, exclusively their own benefit. If you add to that, hypothetical scenario, the employee responds to that email from their mobile phone while they're at the drive-thru at their favorite quick-serve restaurant nearby. Does that change the analysis? And I think a lot of our plaintiffs' bar friends and some law on this subject would indicate that the answer is no, that was work and it needs to be compensated for. For these reasons, because of these challenges, meal break deductions or auto-deduct policies, rather, can be risky unless you're certain that the time was completely duty-free. So next slide, please. All right. The point we want to make here is that work from home creates new risks and new opportunities for employees to work off the clock, whether it's before a shift, after a shift, or during what's intended to be a non-compensable work break. And the greater challenge here is that employers often are going to have less visibility of it. When the employee's not sitting in your office or sitting in your work environment where you can oversee them and you have immediate knowledge, it's difficult to manage. It's difficult to manage that issue. So generally, an employer without knowledge of off-the-clock work is not liable to pay for work that they did not have knowledge of. That's a general rule. But an employer that knew or should have known about the off-the-clock work is liable. And there's frequent litigation on this very subject. We see a lot of off-the-clock claims tied to alleged work before and after work or during breaks. And there's lots of arguments related to what an employer knew or should have known when and how. And there is law indicating that management cannot turn a blind eye or stick their head in the sand. So oftentimes I consider this as a rule of thumb. if the employee is required to work, certainly they need to be paid. But if an employee is also allowed to work and they are working, then it's important for them to be paid. So it's thus key that employers set clear expectations. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But when should an employee be working and when should an employee not be working? And be clear on what is meant by that. What do we mean by work? Sometimes employees may not consider that, that random one-word email during a meal break to be work. So I think it's important to be clear what is meant and what the expectations are, including things like emails, texts, answering or responding to phone calls, etc. Having a clear means for employees to track time work, one that's easy and usable, also becomes even more important in the remote environment. And then there's the issue of monitoring or auditing work. And we'll cover this a little bit more, but there's plenty of technology and software out there that we know is being used to track, for example, keystrokes, log in and log out activity, number of calls handled or received, etc. On that front, we want to caution you to be careful about not violating employees' privacy rights and reasonable expectations there. And an important starting point is your policy on the subject, what it says and what expectations have been set. Next slide, please. All right. Now for some tips on potential best practices that may be helpful to you as you're navigating all of these sort of issues that we've gone over. I think that in a remote environment, reiterating even existing policies that work is not permitted off the clock it could use emphasis. I think going back to the policy, looking at the policy, updating the policy to make sure that it accounts for the things that are expected and not expected is important. And give examples. I've been paying closer attention to these work time, off the clock, meal break policies, and trying to offer some more practical thoughts and examples of the types of things that can and cannot be done. Reminders, even frequent reminders to employees to make sure that their time is recorded accurately, I think is helpful. Implementing affirmations or attestations where the employee reviews their time for the pay period and confirms that it's accurate or not, also confirms whether or not they had a full and complete uninterrupted meal break on any day is important, and having them get the opportunity to easily make changes if changes are appropriate to ensure that they're compensated for all of their quote-unquote work time will be helpful. Also, training, not just the employees, but training managers, I think is important. And for that training to be focused on the group. Managers have different goals and expectations than non-managerial employees. And I think making clear to them what your expectations are through training and through the policies is also helpful. An option to make sure that you're prohibiting the type of work that you consider to be the most susceptible to off-the-clock type work can be helpful. Making clear or having a system in place where you cut off access at certain times to various systems, whether it be software, email, phone systems, can help to limit and prevent off-the-clock claims and off-the-clock issues. Next slide, please. I mentioned providing a mechanism for employees to make changes to their time cards or punches, and for it to be easy and to have them trained on it such that they know, for example, if there's an after hours or meal break related work duty like an email, a phone call, or a text requirement, that they know what to do. If they log back on after hours, what to do. And sort of this training for employees on what to do is going to be helpful for you to limit sort of off the clock claims. Also related to that, giving this easy, usable, friendly way for employees to make changes, to log and to edit their time helps you to defend against a claim if it comes because of this notion of an employer knowing or not knowing about off-the-clock work. If you've given the employee a good, easy means of making adjustments and they don't do it, you're better positioned in that case. Next slide. Another helpful hint relates to work schedules. Being clear and setting regular work hours reduces the risk of off-the-clock claims, and it helps employees to maintain work-life balance. They sort of, tend to like that. But it's only really helpful if you can stick to it, which is not always helpful. Reinforcing meal and rest break laws by discussing expectations again is important, making clear that they're going to be paid if they perform work or miss or have uninterrupted breaks. Managing managers was alluded to, and I think that this is important, about what they should be on the lookout for in terms of potential off-the-clock work when it comes to their remote employees, right? I mean, if managers are seeing after hours or meal break time activity, it's something that should be addressed to avoid it becoming a bigger issue. And this concept of pressure that we have listed here is a place where we often see claims arising. The allegation is that the employee had so much work that a reasonable person could not get it done. And so while the manager said, don't work off the clock, at the same time, they're saying you have to get it done and you have to get it done within a certain amount of time. Making clear to managers what they should say and what they shouldn't say, and that they need to avoid this notion of pressure, both with in terms of our policy, practice, and training is important. And then there's the notion of conducting audits, as indicated, monitoring and auditing to make changes. There's certainly pros and cons here. If you audit and you don't do anything about perceived or suspected off-the-clock work, that's going to be pretty darn good evidence that what you did, your failure to pay for that time, was willful. In some places like Massachusetts, if you audit and fix the problem, you still might have issues if you're fixing the problem late, right? We have laws that require payment within a certain period of time after the end of a pay period, and if you don't do it, in some places, Massachusetts is an example, then you're liable. In Massachusetts, you're liable for triple damages even if you fix the problem. So there's a balancing act to be done there. Let's see here. Let's go on to the next slide, and I think we're passing it back to Emily.
Yeah, that's right, and we can keep going past this slide too. So, managing employee performance and addressing underperformance can be challenging in the office on a good day. So whenever you are not able to lay eyes on employees, or when you're starting to notice underperformance issues, trying to figure out what might be going on for someone is a little bit more difficult whenever they're working remotely. Underperformance could be a skill set issue. Does this person just not have the chops to do what we hired them to do? Is this person having time management issues? For the benefits that we talked about with remote work, there's really no disputing that for some people, it's a little bit tougher to get work done at home. It's not the best setup for everybody. Some folks are easily given to distractions around the house, and it just might not be the productive environment that an office would be for them. Is it an ADA issue? We'll talk more about this in just a couple of minutes here, but is there something going on, or should the employer be aware that there's something going on that this employee might need an accommodation in order to be the performer that we hired them to be? Is the employee being dishonest, right? We've all heard those sort of horror stories at this point about the person working from home with 3 jobs. Is this person not actually devoting all of their time to working for me and just plugging in their time card? Does the employee have other demands on their time at home? This sort of ties in with that, time management issue, or is there just something else going on at home that's making it hard for them to get their work done? Or is it a home technology issue? Again, in major metropolitan areas, our internet tends to be pretty swift, but maybe you've got some employees who, really took to watching HGTV during COVID and picked up and moved their life to the middle of nowhere to start their homestead, and now they're using some dial-up connection from the 90s. Is it something technology related that's really slowing this person down? Next slide. And so strategies for addressing performance issues, I think number one here is making sure that the performance metrics that you're using are fair. How do you know that this employee is underperforming? Are they underperforming relative to other people doing what they're doing? Do we see their peers executing a certain number of contracts per week, or making a certain number of calls per day? Or, how are we really measuring performance? Because it comes up sometimes as another wage and hour issue with off the clock cases where employees say, I couldn't get the work that I was being asked to do done during my workday. And so I was having to work off the clock in order to get things done to meet my employer's expectations. And so if your expectations are unfair, that employee is going to have a shot at making that case. So number one, make sure that the metrics that you're using are fair and measurable, and that you're really comparing this person apples to apples to their peers. If you start to see an underperformance issue, start with a candid conversation. Make sure that you memorialize those conversations, ideally in writing to the employee. Help them, ask them to help you understand what might be going on. Do you need to push in training? Sort of on the more practical side, we've seen employers ask employees to provide status updates daily, weekly, whatever seems to make sense. Having employees chat their manager first thing in the morning to really sort of show that they're logged on and engaged. How we can sort of measure engagement when someone's at a distance. Encouraging managers to have video meetings with their employees, maybe more frequent but shorter video meetings, so the manager can really, see this person and talk with them and see that they're engaged. And then this last bullet here, we're starting to get outside the scope of this particular presentation, but at what point might it be appropriate to ask underperformers to return to the office? For those folks where work from home just really isn't working, or maybe it's not working for a particular manager to address these issues with the employee being home. What we will caution about here, though, is just make sure that you're being consistent. And if there is an opportunity to, in a policy, set forth, number one, that you retain this right to call people back into the office. And number two, to maybe set some measurable metrics for when that might happen. X number of performance ratings at X level or lower, we might be asking you to come back in, because what you don't want to do is to have someone come forward with a viable different treatment claim based on the fact that they were asked to come back into the office and they have to, spend all this time commuting and doing all of that, while that other person who had similar issues was not. And so next slide. I'm realizing that we are running out of time, as we sort of suspected we might in a 30-minute presentation. We do just want to highlight here that even though employees may not be coming into the office to physically work on site, an employer still has an obligation to offer reasonable accommodations to employees through an interactive process. And so if you are an employer that becomes aware through an underperformance issue, maybe like we were just talking about, that someone might need an accommodation, you need to start that interactive dialogue with your employees. If you would offer someone an ergonomic chair or keyboard if they were working on site, but they are working from home and say they need those same types of accommodations, you're going to need to analyze on a case-by-case basis, but there's a good argument for the employee that you might still need to apply those same types of accommodations in their home workspace. And I'm going to kick it over to Anthony just briefly to talk about remote work itself as an accommodation.
I'll round us out here. Yes, thank you, Emily. As some of you may have seen, we've noticed employers deal with reasonable accommodation related issues when asking employees to come back to the workplace. Of course, it is important to note that just because an employee may be working remotely doesn't mean that there is not an employer obligation to reasonably accommodate disabilities, provided the individual can perform the essential functions of their job when doing so. when employees are asked to come back to the office, we've seen sort of challenges as it relates to that and requests for more remote work as an accommodation. And one of the things that we've seen a fair amount of is the employer takes the position that, you know, coming or working in the office is an essential function, and then the employee, or oftentimes in our case, the employee's attorney says the individual's been doing their job just fine, you know, for a year or X months. It's plainly not an essential function, at least that's the argument. And so there is a complication there tied to the notion of being in the office as an essential function when it has been performed outside the office for some time. This is an area where if you're dealing with it, you want to engage counsel. But a good rule is to make sure you're evaluating truly what the essential functions are and look at and modify your job descriptions, because they're really the starting place for an essential function evaluation. And just remember that if you're dealing with that type of an issue, while an employee, and these kind of merge together, an employee needs to demonstrate the reasonableness of their accommodation request, the employer is obligated to prove when there's an undue hardship, and that can be a difficult argument to make. I see we're at 1:30. I'll offer the CLE code, folks. It is SS1644. Again, it is SS1644. For those who need to drop, please do. I did see one question come in tied to attestations regarding work time and lunch breaks, and the question is really, you know, where there's an electronic timekeeping system, how do you include attestation where there's little leeway to change the timesheet language with the vendor? I think if I understand the question, I think that starts with a dialogue with the vendor, if you're using a vendor for the issue, to figure out whether or not there's an electronic means of providing an attestation where the employee can confirm that their hours of work for the pay period are accurate. And if there's not, I think, you know, you next want to take a look at whether or not there's a paper way of accomplishing the same thing. With that, folks, thank you again for joining us. We will get you the slides, and stay tuned for the next in our series.